Hey everybody, Matt Wallace bringing you AI every day. I am super excited today because I am going to walk you through some of the use cases and observations I've made about ChatGPT's Code Sandbox. I think it's really interesting because OpenAI has done what appears to be a very interesting job allowing ChatGPT to follow chain of thought type principles. There are times when interacting with it, you'll make a request and it'll say something like, okay, so here are the things that I need to do. And it'll give you a list and then it'll go, let's go step by step. If you are familiar with some of the little techniques to have agents act as quasi-autonomous AIs by essentially going to an LLM and saying, here's the thing I want to get done. What are the steps that I would need to take to do that? And then going back to the LLM with step one and going, this is the first step that I need to do. What should I do? And then empowering those agents to do things like go retrieve data from the internet, etc. You can have long running chains that essentially do very interesting things over a period of time. So far, I think sometimes they are very successful and sometimes their execution is fragile and they get stuck in loops trying to figure out, can I complete this task or not? But some of the famous ones that happened early on in this wave of AI, generative AI, are Baby AGI and AutoGPT. Both of them made some waves as they popped out. So what's interesting is I know that there are a lot of efforts as well to make chain of thought type principles apply internal to a model so that models can produce more accurate answers. And it can allow them to more accurately do things like answer math problems correctly. So that having been said, let's dive right into some of the code interpreter examples. I'm going to bring some of these up on the screen to show you, but if you're not watching this visually, of course, I'll be talking through them. This happened to me first time, 1 a.m. My wife was falling asleep against my shoulder, and I happened to open up the OpenAI site, the ChatGPT app in Chrome on my phone to ask some kind of question. And I think I clicked on the GPT-4 button or something because maybe it defaulted to 3.5. And I noticed the code interpreter is available to me, and I immediately get super excited. So my very first thing that I did is I asked it, what kind of files can you analyze? I think that if you look at the dropdown, it actually says this is a model that can do things like analyze files. And so it tells me I can do text like JSON, text, CSV, etc., doc files, so docx, PDF, PPT, PowerPoint. I mean, I've actually used this on both PowerPoint as well as PDF. I'll talk about that. Code files, so Python, JavaScript, HTML, etc. And it says I can help understand, explain, or debug code snippets in these files. That doesn't necessarily mean it can write code. I haven't tested this, but it claims it can only run Python in the sandbox, but it still understands what Java files are, it's saying. And of course, it's actually incredibly facile with converting different types of text formats around. If you have things like JSON and you want to reformat it to YAML, or you had like GraphQL output from a query that you wanted to convert into YAML, I think it does a very good job typically at tasks like that. Then image files, and it says I can perform basic operations such as displaying the images. More complex things like image analysis or object detection aren't possible in this environment. That really has to do with some of the limitations. So I'll get into this, but the bot claimed that it could handle files uploaded up to 250 megabytes. That seems very generous. That's impressive. But it can't install libraries, so it has a pretty wide set of Python libraries that are available to it. This is not a naive environment, right? There's a lot of packages that come pre-installed in its sandbox. I expect that will change over time. I actually wish, and maybe they will, but I wish that OpenAI would keep up and let us know what is in the environment and what can be added. Having played around with this a little bit, I also felt security people must be completely having a field day trying to jailbreak the code sandbox. And I suspect that's why this took quite a while to roll out. So I'm also going to preface this by saying too, that there are all kinds of interesting things going on here that have a lot to do with the architecture of GPT under the hood, which also may have changed since launch. I'm not going to cover that this episode, but do tune in next episode. And I'm going to talk about some of the information that's been swirling around about how it's architected. Image files, data files like Excel, and then audio files like MP3. I've pretty much touched all of these at this point, and in fact, I think almost all of them are in my examples today. So we'll walk through some of the things that can be done. And I go, if you want to analyze multiple code files that are related, do I upload them one at a time, or can you upload a zip? You can upload a zip. That's really useful for if you're doing code And in fact, one of the first things I did was, and I think what I'll do is I'll jump right over to my fourth tab here, and we'll go right into one of these use cases that I used. So I've been working on an app that was a little bit of an AI personal assistant, but as I started to build it, I realized immediately there were things I wanted to do in terms of managing prompts and their efficacy over time that I wasn't necessarily going to get from the tools out there that I know of today. Like Prompt Layer is a great tool for retrieving prompts and getting prompt statistics, but I wanted a little bit more composability than it had, and I wanted a little bit more in terms of libraries and sharing and things. And what I ended up doing was I ended up writing a basic model for a few things like prompt templates, elements of prompts, prompt roles. You will act as a elite marketing professional. You will act like a PhD physicist, whatever those things that you try to tell it to get better results out of your prompts. And then, of course, prompt systems or system prompts, which basically is the sort of hidden prompt. It matters in the context of LLMs because the system prompt tends to be very visible to the model during inference, even if you have created a whole lot of context. So if you're using ChatGPT, for example, it always understands what the system prompt is, no matter how many pages of stuff you're doing. And you probably realize that if a conversation goes on long enough in ChatGPT, it will forget things that you said earlier. And that's because there is a limited context window that can be passed to these models. With that having said as background, code interpreter, I go to GitHub and I take my code because I've gotten to the point where I have all my models defined and I have the endpoint for prompt template. The Flask app is up, it's working. Swagger docs are working and I can see them. I can make an API call and do that. But I haven't yet defined all the endpoints in code for prompt elements, prompt system, prompt roles. I'm like, well, let's make it do the work. And so I go on my phone to GitHub and I say, give me the zip download of the code. I take that, I pass it to ChatGPT, and I'll scroll up here on the screen so you can see it. And I actually hand it the main branch of my code. At this point, it's still called Live Palette, but I'm already deciding I'm going to split the app up and fork off the prompt service because it doesn't make sense to have it just be part of this larger app, and that's fine. It was just the first thing I was doing. And so from there, I hand it to it and I say, just give it a bunch of definitions I've got. I want you to modify the main app file so the other models, prompt system, prompt element, prompt role, have API endpoints implemented in a manner consistent with prompt templates. Tags are a mix-in and as such do not get their own endpoint. They're only applied through models with the taggable mix-in. And I go, you should make the endpoints conform with the specs in the SQL alchemy definition. So I tell it, you're going to have about 12 endpoints. And it goes, okay, let's start by extracting the code. Then it looks and it finds all the code and it digs into the source file and the model file and it sees all the things and it's reading it. And then it spits up a bunch of stuff. It goes, given the complexity of the task, it would be best to view the full contents of these files, especially this and that. And then I think it's because it's spent so much time so far, it knows that its execution time is winding down because ChatGPT will time out. I think it's something like 2 minutes. And if it's still streaming you tokens after 2 minutes, it stops. Although, thank you, OpenAI, they put a little continue generating button. So it doesn't just end abruptly and you don't have to go as much, hey, you got cut off. You just click continue generating. Although under the hood, for all I know, it's sending a prompt that says you were cut off. So I say, go ahead and make those changes. And it goes ahead and pulls in the main Flask app. It says what there are, and it's a get, put, post, delete for the prompt template, the thing that I said was fully baked. According to your instructions, you want similar endpoints created for, and it names the other 3 models case sensitively. And it goes, hey, I don't have the full detail of that prompts PY file where the models are defined. Can you provide it? And I go, no, you do have it, actually. What's interesting is it says, could you please provide the contents or details about the model? I just say you can now read in the full prompts PY file from the zip, and it goes, okay. And then it does it. So had a little tiny bit of confusion. Now, I didn't quite get the result exactly that I wanted with this thing. It didn't spit out completely functional code, but it did a pretty workmanlike job of getting moving. And if I wasn't doing this on my phone in the quiet of the night, trying not to wake my wife up, it probably would have gone even better. Suffice it to say, I get through this and it was pretty stellar, pretty amazing to watch it, read in the zip, analyze the code structure, look at what it needed. This is a far cry from using ChatGPT for code previously when you were always pasting chunks of text. It was very easy for it to not get the full context. And it was a little bit frustrating. And I actually at one point wrote a full clone of the GPT interface, like the ChatGPT interface. because there are times I like having the back and forth of connecting to it and having a dialogue about code. But there are times when it's very frustrating because the ChatGPT interface won't accept as input more than about 2,000 tokens. But in a scenario where you want a small answer, a small function written, and you're trying to provide 4K or 6K tokens of context like you could with the GPT-4 API, and then get it to disgorge data, it's a little bit frustrating. And so being able to have it use the sandbox as a way to ingest more information is good. You can tell literally from just the first prompt or two that I went through here, it was possible for it to even lose the context of the fact that it had this whole file locally. It was saying, can you provide this? Because it had lost track. It's important, though, to remember that with models like this, there's a sort of, I almost want to say completion intent. It's very easy for them to paint themselves into corners. This is why prompts like count the number of words in the answer to this question don't work. So let's go into another one where I actually asked it to diarize audio. For those who are not aware, diarizing essentially means to go through and to use techniques to understand which voices are distinct speakers. So if you have, say, 4 people on a conference call or 2 people on a podcast, it's the thing that knows that person A and person B are distinct, and it uses characteristics about their speech to make sure that the transcript is correctly assigned to them on a time basis. And I hand it the MP3 file, and it goes, so you want me to split it up and transcribe it. And then it says, transcription process won't be perfect, may contain errors. I'm already thinking, that's weird. I didn't think you could transcribe. And it actually suggests Google Speech Detect, Amazon Transcribe, IBM Watson Speech, because it literally, although it's interacting with me in real time, its training data does not conclude knowledge of OpenAI's Whisper API, which is my favorite of all these speech to text APIs. I have to say, having transcribed quite a bit of audio with OpenAI's Whisper API, and at least one version of that, incidentally, is available as open source, seemed much more accurate. And so things like jargon, if you said, oh, I'm going to go grab the XPF device, it would translate XPF directly into the acronym, as opposed to if you're used to doing this on something like a Siri, you wouldn't be surprised to see it go EX dash when you said X. We go in and we dive into this, and it says, I can't do diarization. And I actually say, okay, can you instead help me with code? Because before I go to try to diarize it myself, I'd like to make sure that I'm splitting the audio into chunks that make sense. So if you have a 80 megabyte audio file, you can't just hand that as is to Whisper because its upload limit is 25 megabytes, but you don't really want to split in the middle of a word. And so what you really want is you want to find a gap of low intensity where there's a pause in the audio. You want to split it there because it's not the middle of a word. If there's low intensity for 600 milliseconds, the better part of a second, usually means that there's some kind of pause, right? Of course, I don't have to pause. No breathing here. Just kidding. Now we can scroll around. We can see it provided some code to do that. And it's a funny thing where it actually tells me it can't execute code locally. And I go and I say, I'm testing it, but you're a sandbox version of GPT and you can execute code locally. And it goes, and then it immediately starts to execute it locally, which is too funny. But I've seen this happen now with ChatGPT Sandbox. Claude does this as well. Claude actually claimed it couldn't process PDFs and then did read PDFs. It was pretty funny. So it wrote this voice activity detection, and it was executing it, and it timed out. And so this is useful, and I'll unroll this, but it's demonstrative of something you have to be aware of, which is there is a limitation on how long the code that ChatGPT is executing in the sandbox can run. So it gets interrupted here. You notice at the very end, keyboard interrupt, and effectively that's some kind of an IPython environment. I've seen the IPython thing in other parts of the code. It was trying to go ahead and do this processing, but because it was an 80 meg file, it was just too long for it to execute under its time frame. I had actually started executing it before it did. It finished way after the sandbox version had already timed out and sent this message. But if you think about this, it's still useful for it to have tried, like useful for me, because even though it failed and couldn't give me output, which I don't really care that much about because I can run it locally, it's useful because if there's some sort of like runtime error that's going to immediately pop up, good examples here being, oh, I forgot to import this. Oh, this library doesn't have that function call in this version, all those types of things. That's going to emit immediately. So pretty cool. And this This code did work, and I haven't actually gotten to the diarization part. I went back and forth with it just to tweak things a tiny bit, but it was able to chunk the audio correctly. So for the next one that I'm going to cover, and I've got 2 more to go. I know this is going to be a long episode. So I've got 2 more to go. I actually have been trying to work on a children's book for my daughter. She's 3. She loves whimsical things. She's very bright. She loves story time. I had used Midjourney to generate an image of a girl in her bedroom asleep. Maybe presumably she was up late reading. She's got a unicorn poster on the wall. This is more of a painting than a poster. And you can see this black and white version. You might be thinking, wait, what? So you can see in this, I've uploaded an image and I said basically simply upscale and sharpen this image. The reason why, of course, is 1024 by 1024 doesn't seem like enough pixels for me if you want to take a book to print or you want it to look really nicely on a high-res display. If somebody's viewing landscape on an iPad, they have more than twice that number of pixels. I'm not 100% sure what the resolution of an iPad is, but obviously Apple makes a pretty big deal out of their fantastic resolutions, which are great. And so I wanted to be able to upscale an image. And honestly, there are a bunch of other tools to do this. So a good example is there's a couple products on the market that actually use AI models to do upscaling. And it's probably superior to this because they're not just doing sort of quantification versions of upscaling. But still, I think it was a good use case for really quickly doing something useful with the Code Sandbox. It immediately takes the image, it writes some code. It says, current technologies for image upscaling can increase the size of the image, but they can't add details that weren't in the original image. They attempt to estimate and fill the missing information. The result may not be perfect. And that jibes. If there's not enough detail, you can't handle it. This is why, of course, that whole infamously cheesy CSI enhanced thing wasn't actually realistic, because computers without AI models couldn't just upscale something and deterministically figure out what it ought to look like. That data doesn't exist. So that having been said, it gives me back a black and white image, and I look at the code really briefly, and I understand from the code that it has basically converted the entire RGB image into a grayscale image, upscaled it, and then converted it back to an RGB image. But I understand immediately, instinctively, that's not going to work because converting it to RGB has thrown away the color channel information, and now it's gone and you can't get it back. That's okay, though. I complain to it, and it goes, oh, you're right. Converting it to grayscale loses color, but converting it back doesn't restore the original colors. I'll have to apply the sharpening filter to each color channel separately. So it does that. This is a good time, and I'm actually going to show you these 2 images. And I do, when I'm doing video, I tend to put these on YouTube at 4K. And so hopefully you're watching the 4K version, but I'm going to actually drag from off screen the other version of this image. So you should be able to see it. And we can do a little bit of a comparison, and we'll hone in on the unicorn poster that's on the wall. On the left, the unicorn image, and I've just blown it up inside of Chrome, but you can see it's blurry. It's just sort of fuzzy around the edges of the hair. The stars don't look that sharp in the background of the picture. It's fine. You jump over to the upscaled image that ChatGPT had. It's not zoomed in as much, and I think it's half as much because I think I upscaled from 1024 to 2048. And so you've got the unicorn here, and you can actually see, if you're looking at this in high res, the stars in the background are a little sharper. The hair on the unicorn mane in particular it's very distinctly sharper. Now, this sort of upscaling has its flaws, and I'm not even 100% sure that everyone would agree, even though the image on the right is sharper, that it's necessarily better. The one on the left is blurry, so the hairs look fuzzy, like they were at a distance, like you can't see them that well. Have your, lens prescription checked on your glasses, whatever. The one on the right, it's definitely more distinct. You can see distinctly the hairs, but it has a little bit of a chunkiness and a blockiness to it. It's very faint. I actually see the same thing in the image on the left. If I look at this unicorn ear that's closest, it definitely still has like striation along the edge of the ear. It has a similar thing on the right, but then lots of other things like this little chunk of flowers that its ear is wearing, essentially. They look much sharper, and they look inarguably better to me. And if I scroll down to the girl herself in the picture, looking at the hair on the left, it's just fuzzy, it's just blurry. On the right, it's just sharper. Overall, I feel like her face is in general sharper. So along the edge of the lips, for example, over here, it just seems fuzzy and blurry. And here it seems more or less right. I think if you were to zoom in much further, it would be obvious that there were some sort of chunky artifacts, but I think that really happens on both sides. there is a limit to how well this works. Like you can't just continue to upscale because this chunking effect continues to become more dramatic, essentially. It's not very good necessarily at blending on curves. This is where AI starts to get much better. And I think when I do this in practice to make the book, when I do upscaling, I will use one of the AI upscaling tools. And then we jump into my last use case. So that was really cool. I actually, incidentally, for the image upscaling, I took it through the process because I wanted to experiment. I had it perform it different ways, like increasing the magnitude of the sharpening, having it upscale it twice. So from 1024 to 2048, 2048 to 4096, upscaling each time. I think in the grand scheme of things, like it was pretty great doing one upscale to 2048, 2048, but it definitely does not improve as much doing it again because it's making little blocks of pixels more distinct from what I can perceive. And therefore, it actually amplifies those distinctions. Whereas a blurry hair used to be a sort of blend across several pixels because it wasn't really sure where the hair should be. Now it's got a sort of like chunk and it enhances that chunk. And so you almost get like in deep into the image, you're getting like a staircase view of the pixelation. Again, something AI would probably help with. I actually suspect tools like Photoshop probably have that built in too, and I've been using the beta. And at some point, I should probably talk about how much fun it is to mix Gen AI tools like Midjourney with the Gen AI that's built into Photoshop, because you can obviously do a lot to customize a Midjourney image. Like, for example, in this image, there's something going on with a foot here, what appears to maybe be a foot. That's going to have to come out of the final, right? It doesn't look like she's in the right position to have a foot there. Her hands look maybe too large. I like the rest of the image, though. Worked on it for a while. I feel like I might change the hands, move a hand, cover her with a blanket, and all that can be done in Photoshop using their Gen AI tools. So it's pretty neat. And you can isolate the Photoshop changes to a very distinct area. So it's really great for spot fixing. It's also really good at taking things out of images. So for the last use case here, I'm going to show you analysis of, we're going to completely shifting gears here. This is much more business oriented, but we're going to completely shift gears here. And we're going to analyze Snowflake case studies. So I happen to have a ton of case studies pulled from Snowflake's site. They do a great job of highlighting customer use cases and wins there. I've been doing analysis on those. Try to figure out how good you can get at having AI tease things out of it. And what I did here is I just handed the whole zip over. It's 140 something case studies, all in PDF form. I just threw it in a zip, dumped the whole thing in ChatGPT's lap, and I go, I'd like you to build some charts showing common pain points, the most common titles of named customer contacts, the typical number of clouds a customer in one of these case studies uses if specified. I'm also interested in you exploring other common themes in PDF that could be turned into cohorts and graph, bar, pi, et cetera, acceptable, blah, blah, blah. And it goes to perform this analysis. And now you see this chain of thought type thinking working really distinctly. So to perform this analysis, I'll follow these steps. I'll unzip the file and extract the PDFs. I'll parse each PDF to extract the text. I'll analyze text to identify and count the most common pain points, customer titles, number of clouds used. I'll explore the text for additional common themes or data that could be graphed, and I'll identify information that suggests a customer might still have multiple copies of their data even after adopting Snowflake, or might be interested in multi-cloud data solutions. Yeah, I mentioned multi-cloud data solutions in the first paragraph. And so it goes and starts doing this. And it says, hey, there's no zip files. And I go, hey, it's got a bunch of folders and each folder has a zip. It adjusts what it's doing. It finds all the zip files, and it actually goes on and on here. Now, this is interesting because first it goes, I successfully extracted text from 142 PDF files. Second, it tries to use a natural language library it doesn't have access to do analysis. And so you can actually see it's trying to use this NLTK library, Natural Language Toolkit, and it can't because it says this library requires downloading additional resources such as stop words, but the current environment does not allow internet access for security reasons. I love how distinct it is. Like, it completely understands its own sandbox. And it's such a weird thing sometimes to have conversations with ChatGPT because it's like, my knowledge cutoff is September of 2021. And yet it has very distinct understanding of the current environment in which it operates. So it's obviously very well trained on its own sort of limitations. And scroll down in this, suffice it to say, it comes through 142 PDFs without me doing much in the way of intervention other than a couple other things. You can see in some cases, I'm just saying stuff like proceed to give it the opportunity to jump back. And then it starts graphing things. And I'll scroll down to where it starts rendering graphs, right? It actually, I joked on Twitter the other day that Matplotlib was about to get a lot more popular because honestly, it can be a pain to take data and start converting it into graphed format. But now you have ChatGPT doing it for you, and it's pretty good at conceiving of and rendering graphs. And so you can see it does a whole bunch of things here where it generates things about common pain points and common titles and number of clouds that are mentioned. And it's actually searching for words like AWS and Amazon Web Services. If you look at the code, it understands what a cloud is. So knowing it doesn't have access to natural language processing, it's doing its best to do it with pattern matching against words that it knows to be clouds. And finally, it just looks for common words and general themes. Data and Snowflake, unsurprisingly, the most popular. Over 800 mentions of the word data, it says. And honestly, that seems like not that much for 142 PDFs about Snowflake. Suffice it to say, it spits out graphs. And I love this. Actually, I lied. I have one more use case to show you. And this one was really interesting. And I actually basically downloaded a Zoom transcript. In this case, I only downloaded the transcript. And I don't think it can do speech to text. But I downloaded a Zoom transcript for a call that was over an hour. And I just handed it the transcript and said, summarize what this person said, and then summarize what these people said. And I was able to have it spit back to me summary of everything that happened in that call. So that's another amazing use case. It's really interesting. And I think that this opens up tons of questions about the economics of these things. Because I'm done with my use cases, I'm going to go ahead and shut this window. No need to look at the screen anymore. But I will say, I think it opens up interesting questions about the economics of some of these use cases. And it goes to show that ChatGPT and the ChatGPT Plus subscription is providing a lot of interesting value. Because yes, you're getting it to answer questions and it can do a lot of inference work for you. But some of these things are substantial. Processing an hour's worth of audio, the size of that transcript, is a pretty substantial amount of inference to be doing. If it was doing this itself internally, I almost feel like it has to essentially it doesn't do this visibly in the code sandbox, but I almost think it has to be going, okay, I've got this huge file. The classic way to do this with LangChain is to split the document, hand it the document and say, take notes about this, take notes about this, take notes about this, right? Segment by segment, and then have it collate all the notes at the end. But in this case, I don't know really what it's doing internally. There's obviously no LangChain directly operating here because it's all happening inside the ChatGPT interface. But I don't think that the model works differently. So I think that there's still a number of tokens, and I don't think they would use necessarily automatically the 32K token model and fit this all in. I have a podcast coming out, a future rodeo, that you should definitely check out and subscribe, where I'm doing some long form interviews with cool people in technology. My first episode, which is out imminently, is with Anna Claiborne. I talked about this on the last podcast. I showed this live of sorts, which was, I actually used it to generate show notes. So it was 3 hours and 15 minutes. So the transcript was fairly copious. And even with the long model, I think it had to be broken into 3 or 4 chunks. Not the 32K model, but I didn't really want to use it because I just don't know how good it is at summarizing at that scale yet in one shot. And so I was using LangChain to basically pass chunks of that transcript in to get notes repeatedly. And then when it was done, it would summarize those. I hope you enjoyed today's much longer episode going through some of these Code Sandbox use cases. I've been playing around with it a lot, and it's been super useful for all kinds of different things. It doesn't surprise me that there's a lot of messages popping up in the ChatGPT interface talking about how their servers are overloaded, because it definitely feels like there's a ton of utility here, both for fun things as well as getting work done. So I hope you enjoyed the show today. Whatever platform you're on, please give me a like, subscribe, follow me, and I'm going to be sharing a lot more fun stuff coming up in the future. My next episode, I'm actually definitely going to be talking about the architecture of GPT-4 and some evolution there, because there's a lot of stuff floating around the net that seems very credible, and I'd like to talk about some of it and what it means for the future of AI models and their applicability to practical use cases. See you soon.